Today is 7 November 2021. I'm making another video again because today I am very upset when I see this news on Channel News Asia. It says that anti-COVID-19 vaccination videos on YouTube channel by Iris Cole, Healing the Divide, have been removed for violating community guidelines. Okay, first, why am I so upset to see this news? Because since the start of the COVID pandemic, I've been following both mainstream and alternative news about COVID pandemic and COVID vaccines. And I am familiar with Iris Cole and Healing the Divide. Healing the Divide is not an anti-vaccination or anti-vaxxer Telegram channel. Many of us have taken vaccinations since we are a child. There are also people who have taken COVID vaccinations on Healing the Divide Telegram group. Some of them don't want to take the third booster shot when it will be rolled out next year because they have suffered some side effects from their first 2 jabs of COVID vaccines. Some of them are very sympathetic to the discrimination, the punishment and bullying of the unvaxxed by the Singapore government. And they do not agree with the very harsh, relentless punishment on the unvaxxed by the Singapore government. The Singapore government is creating a very deep division in the community by discriminating and punishing the unvaxxed in Singapore. Secondly, why am I very upset when I see this news? Let's scroll down. Yes, Healing the Divide warns people about the dangers of vaccination. So firstly, you can see that the group Healing the Divide is not anti-vaccination, is not by anti-vaxxers. But yes, we are anti-COVID-19 vaccine. Why? Because there are dangers about COVID vaccines that have been deliberately concealed from the public. What are the dangers about COVID vaccines? Firstly, it contains suspicious ingredients. Japan has already found that Moderna contains stainless steel, aluminum. So COVID vaccines have been found to contain, yes, aluminum, stainless steel, graphene oxide, and even parasites. Secondly, many people have suffered adverse reactions and side effects from taking COVID-19 vaccines, but they have all been covered up and swept under the carpet by the Singapore government. You don't see any news, you don't see much news about COVID-19 vaccine side effects and adverse reactions on mainstream media. But people have been going to see doctors about their COVID-19 vaccine side effects and adverse reactions. And some of them have been denied that what the side effects that they are having are being caused by COVID-19 vaccines. Some of them are even turned down by their doctors for getting a letter stating that what they're suffering from are the side effects and adverse reactions from COVID-19 vaccines. So COVID-19 vaccine side effects and adverse reactions have been covered up and concealed from the public and basically swept under the carpet. Okay, third, why am I upset and angry when I see this news? Let's scroll down again. MOH says that the YouTube channel posts content that perpetuates falsehood, misleading information, and misinformation. Okay, this is very interesting. What constitutes falsehood, misleading information, and misinformation? Basically, anything that the Singapore government doesn't like you to know, doesn't want you to know, that is not being reported in mainstream media, that is being reported in alternative media, are all classified as falsehoods, misleading information, and misinformation. As I've said, I've been following both mainstream and alternative news and information about COVID-19 pandemic and COVID-19 vaccines since the start of the pandemic early last year. So I'm familiar with both sides of the story. So basically, what has been happening is that there is very heavy and systematic censorship of anything that the mainstream media and the mainstream narrative doesn't want you to know. So let's look at MOH saying that the Healing the Divide video has been removed for violating YouTube's community guidelines, okay, as well as Facebook community guidelines. So as I've said, there are many doctors, scientists, and researchers who have spoken up and shared news and information about COVID pandemic and COVID-19 vaccines that run contrary to the mainstream narrative and the mainstream media. But they have all been systematically and heavily censored since last year. This is nothing new. So the censorship by big tech, which is YouTube, Facebook, Google, Twitter, has been happening since last year. So basically, they will just take down and remove any contents, videos, posts, news that runs contrary to the mainstream narrative and mainstream media. Basically, anything that they don't want the public to know, anything that they don't want you to know, the big tech and mainstream media will remove it. So for those who only read sources of news and information from mainstream media such as Channel News Asia, Straits Times, you will not be able to read and access alternative news that has been systematically and heavily censored by big tech and mainstream media since last year. So basically, when they say you violate YouTube community guidelines, you violate Facebook community guidelines, what does it mean? It doesn't mean that what you have posted is not true. It means that what you have posted is not what big tech and mainstream media wants you to know. So they just take it down, even if it's the truth. This has been systematically been happening since last year, when the first US doctors and researchers and scientists have spoken out about COVID-19 vaccines and COVID pandemic. Some big names have even been censored from YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. Let's look at just some of the names. The scientists who discovered ivermectin and won Nobel Prize for it had their YouTube video removed because they violate YouTube community guidelines for saying that ivermectin can be useful for treating COVID-19. Robert W. Malone, the inventor of mRNA vaccines, has also been censored from mainstream media, from these big techs. Mike Eden, former researcher and VP, Vice President of Pfizer, has also been censored from Facebook and Twitter. And these are just a few of the many doctors, scientists, and researchers who have spoken out to warn about the ingredients of COVID-19 vaccines, to warn about the potential adverse reactions and side effects of COVID-19 vaccines. And those who post about how ivermectin can be used to treat COVID. All this news that the mainstream media don't want you to know, all this news that runs contrary to this mainstream narrative, has all been systematically and heavily censored, including from big names that I've mentioned and many reputable doctors and scientists who have spoken out. Okay, let's see why. Why are they so keen to censor alternative news? We know that in science, we have to look at both sides of the story. We have to consider both sides. We have to consider facts and figures and experiments from both sides to come to an informed conclusion. But why is the mainstream media and even governments so afraid of you knowing about the alternative news, alternative information, and want to conceal all that from you? This is because the Pfizer vaccines that's being given out by governments around the world, including the Singapore government, to the people, are still under EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. Okay, the COVID vaccines that are being given out are experimental, and everybody who are taking COVID vaccines from now, in fact from this year until 2023, are all part of a big human experimental trial. The trial of COVID-19 for COVID-19 vaccines will only be completed in 2023. So it's experimental. That means we don't know the long-term side effects. There are some short-term side effects and adverse reaction that we are still discovering about. And these COVID-19 vaccines are still under EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. What does that mean? It means that the manufacturers of the COVID-19 vaccines, such as Pfizer and Moderna, cannot be held liable if anything happens to you if you take the COVID-19 vaccine. The governments will also not be liable. Singapore government has given out some compensation for those whom they acknowledge have suffered from COVID-19 vaccines, but those are just a few of the many who have suffered COVID-19 vaccines but are denied by their doctors and Singapore government that what they are suffering from are side effects and adverse reactions from COVID-19 vaccines. So why is the EUA Emergency Use Authorization so important? Because why is ivermectin being censored so heavily? Ivermectin has been used with success in parts of India, in Japan, in Africa. Ivermectin has proven to bring down their COVID cases and deaths greatly in parts of India, Japan, and Africa. But their success has been heavily censored again from mainstream media and by the Singapore government. Why is that so? Because if there is a cure for COVID-19, then COVID-19 vaccines cannot be authorized for use under Emergency Use Authorization. That means if COVID-19 has a proven cure, then the Singapore government cannot force everyone to take COVID-19 vaccines. Of course, until now, Singapore government has been saying that taking of COVID-19 vaccines is voluntary. But as we have seen for the past few weeks, the Singapore government has been discriminating and punishing the unvaxxed in Singapore very hard, very heavily, and very relentlessly, because unvaxxed have been banned from almost everything in Singapore. So this is one basis to understand why the censorship of alternative news, information, videos, etc. is so heavy and is so systematic. And this has been happening since last year. Let's understand it from another perspective. The Singapore government has invested heavily in mRNA vaccines. Temasek has invested US $250 million in BioNTech. So that means Temasek has invested lots of money in Pfizer BioNTech. EDB Singapore has invested US $500 million together with other investors in Moderna. Ho Cheng is on the board of Wellcome Lead, which is a company that does research in mRNA vaccines. And Pfizer, the Singapore government has signed a secret agreement with Pfizer. Ong Ye Kung has refused to reveal details about the contract. But Pfizer will be setting up a factory in Singapore, and Pfizer will also be setting up an office in Singapore. So the Singapore government has big vested interest in mRNA vaccines. So there is a conflict of interest for the Singapore government to keep pushing COVID-19 vaccines so hard in Singapore and seeing COVID-19 vaccines as the only cure that can take Singapore out from the pandemic situation that we're in now. But the reverse is true. As we have seen, right now in Singapore, November 2021, 85% of the Singapore population has been vaccinated. We are one of the highest vaxxed country in the world. But our number of COVID-19 cases and deaths are at all-time high, and it's not going down. So just common sense. The higher the vaccination rate, the higher the number of COVID cases and deaths. So what does it mean? The vaccines don't look like they are working. In fact, it's the opposite. Countries that are not as highly vaxxed as Singapore are doing much better than Singapore in terms of COVID cases and deaths. In fact, there's a recent ranking. Singapore is ranked 100 in the world in how well it is handling the COVID-19 pandemic. Japan, which has already started using ivermectin, is ranked high on the chart. Okay, let's look at another news that is pretty crazy. Ho Ching mentioned, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, that Singapore government wants to start vaccinating children between 5 and 11 years old as early as end of this year. Okay, WHO has already said that children should not be taking COVID-19 vaccines. We all know that children are not affected much by COVID-19 virus. So we should not be giving COVID-19 vaccine, which is an experimental jab, which we don't know is long-term side effects, to young children, especially healthy young children. The risk clearly outweighs the benefits when the Singapore government plan to start giving COVID-19 vaccines to children 5 to 11 starting next year, 2022, or even as early as end of this year. Ho Ching clearly wants to do that, as she has been posting on her Facebook. But as I've mentioned before, Ho Ching hates Temasek, and Temasek has invested heavily in BioNTech. Ho Ching is the wife of our Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, and Singapore government has invested heavily in mRNA vaccines, and Ho Ching is on the board of Wellcome Leap. So we have to see what Ho Ching has been posting and pushing for COVID-19 vaccines in Singapore. So Ho Ching has been pushing COVID-19 vaccines hard onto the Singapore population, and we have to understand what are her vested interests and the vested interests of the Singapore government. So now we are able to see and understand everything in its overall full context. So So everybody, I want you to go and think very hard about why alternative news, information and videos have been systematically and heavily censored by big tech and from mainstream media. So they may have been removed for violating community guidelines. But what are YouTube and Facebook community guidelines? Because when so many people who spoke out have been censored, just like Healing the Divide. So basically, violating community guidelines means anything they don't want you to know. Bear in mind that